What can we learn from reflecting on these caretaker guides for those caring for family members or patients with dementia? Why do dementia patients often lash out aggressively? How can we figure out what's causing their frustration so we can remove the cause? How can we step into their world rather than try and bring them back into a reality they're no longer capable of understanding? How can dementia patients not know they are hurting us, the caregiver, while still knowing how to push our buttons? And how can we deal with this? Should we feel guilty as caretakers when we respond angrily to our family member who has dementia? And in our thumbnail, we learned recently from his family that Bruce Willis is suffering from dementia, which means he cannot battle terrorists and skyscrapers anymore. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. And we'll start off with a discussion of the sources we used for this video. Rotary has historically supported the Alzheimer's Association and funded research for Alzheimer's and dementia both locally and nationally. These reflections are based on my personal experience and research. My sources are cited, but these views are not endorsed by the Rotary or the Alzheimer's Association. If you have any questions about Alzheimer's or dementia, their 24/7 hotline is 800-272-3900. If you wish to visit our South Florida Rotary Club, please refer to the YouTube description for more information. What is my experience caring for Alzheimer's patients, and do I have any relatives who I cared for who suffered from dementia? My mother passed away from Lou Gehrig's disease, or ALS, and I helped care for her, assisted by home health aides while I was working. Now, this is also a neurological disease with some similarities to dementia, except that the part of the brain that is affected controls motor skills rather than cognition. ALS patients typically first stumble, then they lose the ability to walk, then they lose use of their arms, and then they have trouble breathing. But they rarely lose their mind and rarely suffer from pain. But I did have to face some of the caretaker issues that families with dementia patients face. So how did I become first aware of dementia? When I intervened as a condominium officer to stop the foreclosure of a destitute owner so he could be appointed a guardian by the court. And this guardian placed him in a compassionate lockdown facility for Alzheimer's patients, and then sold his units and paid his debts. Now, many in the community were fed up with this demented behavior. His only family was an estranged sister. That is all I know. Perhaps they were estranged for decades, but I just can't help but wonder. Did his demented behavior also drive her away? And we also learned that Charlton Heston suffered from dementia. On my channel, we review interesting books, and one of the most interesting books on dementia is by the widow of the famed country music singer, Glen Campbell. Kim was his fourth wife, and after resolving his drug and loneliness problems, she enjoyed about a decade of a truly happy marriage and home life. But then his behavior evolved as he fell victim to Alzheimer's, but he continued his concert tours until his dementia worsened, making touring impossible. When we reflect on his life before and after Alzheimer's, we also review the 10 early signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's, taken from the Alzheimer's website. This is a touching story. The last album Glen Campbell recorded included lyrics that explored how frustrating it was to live with Alzheimer's. They asked the doctor, should he embark on a last farewell tour? And the doctor encouraged him to tour as long as he was able. Keeping him active would slow down the progression of his dementia, and music often calms the dementia patient. Likewise, we reflected on the challenges faced by Rita Hayworth and Tony Bennett and their families as they slid into Alzheimer's. Rita Hayworth was an early onset patient. She displayed symptoms in her 50s, and her daughter was one of the original board members and fundraisers for the Alzheimer's Association. And Tony Bennett often sang duets with Lady Gaga, and they performed a final concert when his dementia was fairly advanced. Another interesting book we reviewed was Travelers to Unimaginable Lands, which has interesting case studies of both family caretakers and dementia patients. And this is a wonderful book to read if you're a caretaker and feel really guilty if sometimes you lose patience with your family members suffering from dementia, but who still senses how to push your buttons and irritate you. Also, we learned that Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Sean Connery, also known as James Bond, who drank his martinis shaken not stirred, all suffered from dementia in their later years. So if James Bond can come down with dementia, anybody can. We reviewed both the book plus the footnotes. And one of the footnotes suggested the main book that we'll be reviewing today, Learning to Speak Alzheimer's. This book has many patient stories and many practical tips. We'll only give you a sampling. We recommend that you buy the book yourself. The copyright date is 2003, so some of the medical information is a bit dated, But the advice is timeless and will always be helpful. The author's husband had Alzheimer's. She was able to take care of him until he passed away. Then she earned the certifications to continue working with Alzheimer's patients for many years afterward. So she has both personal and clinical experience. The Dementia Caregiver Survival Guide is also helpful. The medical information is more valuable since it has a recent 2023 copyright, and it also has many useful suggestions, but it doesn't have as many case histories of patients. Alzheimer's and dementia are not synonyms. Only about 3/4 of dementia patients suffer from Alzheimer's, but there are other types of dementia as well. And a few of these other types are curable, so you should always ask a specialist for a diagnosis. You just cannot assume that someone with dementia has Alzheimer's, which has no cure presently. And what are the odds of developing dementia? An average of 7% of the people over 65 will suffer from dementia eventually. In the 70s, before the Alzheimer's Association was incorporated, before many professionals knew how to deal with dementia, our author of Learning to Speak Alzheimer's, Joanne Koenig Coste, faced a nightmare when her husband started showing signs of early onset dementia when he was in his 40s. Facing Alzheimer's this young is rare, but there have been cases of early onset dementia of patients in their 30s. Her husband had his own business, but he was losing the ability to manage his business and his time profitably. Our author remembers, "We were near financial ruin. Customers weren't calling us back. New jobs weren't coming our way. He had ever greater difficulty focusing and organizing his thoughts, sometimes rewriting ad copy he had finished the day before. Once so gentle, docile, and fun to be around, he became frustrated and angry. And frustration and anger are part of dementia. Dementia patients often lash out at caretakers when they are frustrated, and our author discusses how to respond to this apparently aggressive behavior. Her husband was not immediately diagnosed with dementia. She remembers. The children chided their father about his absent-mindedness. The prescription for Valium to treat his supposed depression was refilled many times. Sometimes my husband unwittingly doubled the doses or forgot to take them at all. The first stages of dementia, when you could still function somewhat normally. What are some of the memory aids to remind you of this? Now, placing your daily prescriptions in old pill bottles in groups of 7, one for each day of the week, can help. Also, setting a cell phone alarm just before an appointment can be a useful reminder. Now, you got to remember that just because you're a little bit forgetful doesn't necessarily mean that you're in the early stages of Alzheimer's, as I've been forgetful all my life. And I just shared you with some of the memory aids I've always used. I remember that as a teenager, I delayed shaving as long as possible, as I saw it as something else to forget in the morning. Going to the store and forgetting what I first wanted to buy is a common experience, as is driving past my intended destination. And I've never been able to remember names, only numbers. But you should start worrying if you cross categories, like saying your dog is a fork, or you misplace your keys in really odd places like the freezer. Then our author's husband suffered a stroke, which accelerated his decline. She remembers the time he did not seem to recognize our children or me. Sometimes he appeared thoroughly perplexed about our home. Yet I also recall his having enough of his former self that when he looked at our young baby, tears would run down his face. And then he started wandering about the neighborhood. She resisted the advice to institutionalize him. She instead figured out how to care for him at home. But if you're not able to care for your loved one at home, or if you have to work and cannot care for him at home, don't feel guilty about placing him in a facility. If you act out of love, your motives are what matters most. You are not Jesus, and you're not Mother Teresa. You may have to go to work, and you need to consider the needs of the other family members. In life, when someone criticizes you or offers you advice, they always reveal more about themselves, their prejudices, their experiences, and sometimes their guilt, than they reveal about the situation at hand. And that applies to family members, friends, counselors, and doctors. Do you love your neighbor? Do you love those whom you care for? If the answer is yes, you're fine. We all face difficult decisions in life, and whether to place a loved one in a facility is one of those decisions. But how you make the decision often is more important than what decision you make. Remember how the Good Samaritan in the parable helped the stranger beaten by robbers with only the clothes on his back, and how the Good Samaritan lifted him up onto his donkey and brought him to the inn where he was staying? But the next morning he had business to attend to, so he gave the innkeeper a denarius and asked him to take care of his new friend. Now here, Jesus is letting us know that sometimes we can pay the innkeeper to take care of our loved ones when we cannot take care of them ourselves. Now, our author, Koenig Coste, has developed a humanistic approach to caregiving that she calls habilitation. She notes a habilitated person with dementia can live using his or her upper limits of function, intellect, emotion, and spirit, so patients and caretakers can be successful, so they're not weighed down. And there are 5 tenets of habilitation. Make the physical environment work. Simplify their life and eliminate distractions. Know that communication remains possible. Even when words fail them, the patient can communicate in other ways. Focus only on remaining skills. Value what abilities remain. Help the patient compensate for any lost abilities without bringing them to his attention. Live in the patient's world. Never question, chastise, or try to reason with the patient. Join him in his current place or time, wherever that may be, however illogical that world may seem, and find joy with him there. Enrich the patient's life. Create moments for success. Eliminate possible moments of failure, and praise frequently and with sincerity. Attempt to find humor wherever possible. And more importantly, have a specialist evaluate and test the patient. As we said before, there are types of dementia that have a cure. Maybe your loved one suffers from a curable form of dementia. There are other conditions that mask themselves as dementia, and there are short-term conditions that can cause dementia as a byproduct. In particular, cataracts can cause the brain to start shutting down by decreasing the amount of stimulation the brain receives and processes. There are other conditions that can appear to be dementia: alcohol abuse, drug interactions, emotional problems or depression, endocrine imbalance, infection, metabolic disorder, emotional or physical trauma. And David Cassidy of the Partridge Family also suffered from dementia, as did Estelle Getty and the Golden Girls. Our author remembers how Carrie, a caretaker, knew for sure her mother Therese had Alzheimer's, as she displayed all the symptoms. But her support group badgered into having a specialist examine her mother. And she remembers that with the help of a CAT scan, now they use PET scans, the doctors discovered a small tumor growing in Therese's brain. She received the appropriate treatment and slowly returned to her old self, free of dementia. Now, can you remain at work in the early stages of Alzheimer's? And the celebrities were reflected on and were able to perform, but celebrities also have an army of supporting personnel few of us can count on. Often people in normal jobs need to retire early, or they can soldier on until they cannot. The longer they work, the better for them. Our author remembers that Gary was a 61-year-old high school math teacher who chose early retirement when his forgetfulness began to be an issue in class. Over the course of a year, although he had remained kind and caring, he had neglected to correct midterm exams, unknowingly missed a teacher's meeting, continually forgot where he parked his car in the staff parking lot, and had growing difficulties with a curriculum he had used successfully for 19 years. And some faculty members began to talk about how slovenly Gary had become. At home, a burnt teapot, a microwave explosion, and several small kitchen fires had forced him to exist on a diet of cold foods. Now, this is an issue in our condo association, and our advice is if someone has dementia, flip off the circuit breaker to disconnect the stove so the patient doesn't burn down the building. Should the patient be driving? Our author has a checklist to help make that decision, as well as descriptions of the progress of dementia, which we reflected in the biography of Glenn Campbell as his dementia progressed. If the patient insists on driving when they should not, you can disconnect the battery. Most states can revoke the driver's license of someone who's suffering from dementia. Also, our author lists various behavioral changes in the various stages of Alzheimer's, and she discusses the need to have a care plan, taking into account the patient's physical, social, emotional, and spiritual needs. And she discusses the 6 domains: the physical domain, the functional domain, the social domain, the communication domain, the sensory domain, and the emotional domain. And that's your homework for you to read about the needs and these domains when you buy the book. Now, one facilitator at a dementia support group that I attended advised no carding, which means no correcting, no arguing, no rationalizing, no testing of the patient's memory. And what does the world look like from the patient's perspective? We must resist the temptation to discuss the patient in front of us in the third person as though he cannot understand us, especially when he can. Some patients are aware of their condition in the early stages. When Glenn Campbell was planning his final farewell tour, the question came up about what would happen if Glenn had said something embarrassing. And Glenn simply proclaimed, "Just tell him the gosh darn truth. Tell him I've got Alzheimer's. Then they will understand." Our author warns us, people with dementia resent being seen as deaf and dumb. Many of them will talk much less than they did before the diagnosis, and some will stop talking completely, fearful that they will make mistakes. Family members and friends are often put off by the patient's lack of interest in them, or sometimes by their rejection, or their totally bizarre behavior. And we can't blame them for their behavior, as those with dementia are guided by their immediate emotions. Our author reminds us, when visiting someone else's home, even a familiar one, the Alzheimer's patient may hallucinate, seeing or hearing something imaginary. Or they may have delusions. They might say, "I hear people are talking about me." Or they may be paranoid and they might say, "You're stealing all my money, and where did you hide my keys?" And explaining will not help and may make the situation worse by increasing the patient's anxiety. So our author has another helpful checklist and reminds us that most of all that support groups for both the early stage patient and for the caregiver can be very beneficial. And you can find these support groups on the Alzheimer's Association website. Our author has an excellent example how it can be tricky to see the world from the patient's perspective. Once Judy and Paul were visiting in the lobby one late afternoon when Judy walked directly across the room to where one of the visitors was seated and shoved him squarely in the forehead and said, "Stop it." Now what was happening? The sun was shining right in her eyes from the window behind this unlucky and totally baffled visitor. Solution? They closed the shades for the window and then everything was okay. And we'll go to the tenets of habilitation. Number 1, make the physical environment work. Our good author places this on the top of her list. Many dementia patients have problems with sundowning at dusk, so lighting that mimics daylight can be beneficial, especially if you turn up the lights when it starts getting dark outside. She recommends choosing indoor and outdoor color schemes carefully, painting each room a unique color. And she has specific recommendations how to paint the bathroom in particular. Lightly colored and safe flooring is important, and avoid shiny floors if possible. And simplicity is the word when selecting furniture and wall hangings. And most importantly, she says, avoid mirrors. Now sometimes sturdy fish tanks will give them many hours of joy if they don't knock it over. Blaring televisions may be too much stimulation for someone with dementia. Stairs are a problem, and our author discusses all these items in depth with many other suggestions. Tenet 2, communication still remains possible, and our good author cautions us. In the early stage of dementia, speech problems range from occasional word-finding difficulties to a profound loss of language. Then the ability to process and store information declines. Clinicians agree that in the middle stage that a verbal casserole becomes common, with disconnected thoughts spoken aloud and invented words and sounds replacing real ones. In the final stage, speech all but disappears. But we must try to include the patient in conversations whenever possible. This may delay their decline. And Helen Reddy also suffered from dementia. Our good author experienced this loss of language. She remembers, "My husband used the word smish for sandwich. After a while, smish meant food, and then he would say smish whenever he was hungry. You may need to simplify your speech so they can understand you. The time will come when you need to try to communicate with gestures, kind, patient, coaxing gestures." Our good author has suggestions. Approach the person in a calm, gentle manner, and always from the front to foster trust. Set the stage with a speaking tone that reflects respect. Speak slowly in a slow tone, using simple sentences. The patient's hearing is not the problem, so raising your voice is not the answer. And be patient. The person with progressive dementia takes extra time to process information. Tenet 3, focus on remaining skills. Every discussion on dementia patients discusses how difficult it can be to coax them to take a bath or shower. Kim Campbell had fewer problems since her husband liked to take showers with her. Now, long discussions on why they should take baths or showers won't do any good. Our author describes one case when a caseworker had better luck when she kept the patient bundled and warm until they got him into a shower. And if the clothes got wet, that's okay. It's far less difficult to dry the wraps than coax a cold patient into the bath. And she also suggests, again, taking the mirror out of the bathroom as it spooks some patients. Dressing can be another challenge. Our good author remembers that sometimes sweatpants are best, as buttons, zippers, and snaps can be problematic. And many caretakers lay out the clothes for the patient if they can still dress themselves. Some patients want to undress themselves at inappropriate times, so maybe a one-piece jumpsuit with a zipper in the back is a solution. They want to wear the same thing over and over, maybe buy many identical outlooks that they like. Sometimes getting the patient to eat enough is challenging. You need to make sure they drink enough also. Make sure their dentures fit. Make sure they don't have aching teeth. Going to the bathroom sometimes is also a problem. Perhaps having a male patient urinate in the backyard will help if you have enough privacy. Perhaps put a commode by the bed and make sure the path is lit towards the bathroom at night. Now, I remember once when my favorite youngest daughter was young. We went to the mall to ride all the escalators and elevators. And she was so distracted she forgot she had to go to the bathroom and was quite embarrassed. And likewise, sometimes you need to occasionally remind your loved one with dementia to use the restroom. They may forget. Sleeping is often a problem. Often patients with progressive dementia only sleep 6 hours a night. Sometimes day and night become intertwined. Our author advises us that if sleep habits change, we should assess whether these disturbances are linked to physical, medical, or emotional events rather than to the condition. The patient may be getting a cold or a flu, he may need to go to the bathroom, or desire to open a window. One patient slept better if she didn't watch the news before she went to bed. The politicians and the cacophony were causing her nightmares. And our good author has many other suggestions, many helpful checklists, of course. So, again, you need to buy the book. Number 4, Our Patient's World, Behavioral Changes. Our good author begins this chapter with a warning. Never question, chastise, or try to reason with the patient. Join him in his current place or time, no matter when or where that may be, and find joy with him there. If he thinks he is talking to you for the very first time, always say that it is so pleasant to meet him. Our good author has good advice. When a patient's behavior seems to be changing, check out his basic physical comfort. Is he thirsty? Is he hungry? Does he have to go to the bathroom? Is he too hot or cold? Is he over-medicated? Do hearing aids or eyeglasses need to be checked? Does he need to talk to someone about what is happening to him? If he's out of sorts, cranky, agitated, or aggressive, start checking. Is he constipated? Does he have arthritic pain, a sore throat, earache, headache, or bellyache? Is he catching a cold? Is he feeling well? Often patients with dementia display aggressive behavior, and this can be challenging. Our author has a case study where Carolyn, a patient home health aide, was able to keep her cool and handle some apparently aggressive behavior. Not wanting to disturb the patient, who was absorbed in watching the birds in the window, the aide walked behind Jean and put her lunch on the table. Jean became angry and threw the soup in the aide's face. "Get out of my house," Jean screamed. "Get out now, right now, or I'll call the police." And the author explains that this is what is known by clinicians as a catastrophic reaction. And the author explains, Carolyn did leave. She sat in her car for a few moments, wiped off her soup-spattered face, removed her sweater, and returned, this time to the back door. She knocked gently, and when Jean answered, Carolyn took a deep breath, smiled, and said, "Hello, I'm Carolyn. I've come to do some chores for you. Where do I begin?" "Come on in," Jean said. "Would you like to have a cup of tea with me?" And the author explains that this might not have happened had she approached her from the front rather than the rear. But in reality, you may never know what would set Jean off. The author recommends keeping a behavior log, noting the activity, mood, and times of day, and any distractions present, noting odors, sights, and sounds. Some patients have problems with sundowning, showing challenging behavior at dusk. She suggests that filling this time with some pleasurable activity may help. And our author discusses a long list of other typical behavioral changes, including delusions, diminished concentration, accusatory behavior, changes in judgment, getting lost in memories, not recognizing objects, lack of social appropriateness, frequent emotional changes, and finally, problems with holidays. And she has suggestions on how not to overwhelm them on holidays. There are other items on this long list. Tenet 5, enrich the patient's life. Social life is so important for dementia patients, but it is challenging because their attention span is shorter and they're less patient, and they're less able to understand their surroundings. This chapter is filled with ideas for activities the author has suggested. Try having old friends visit to talk about old times. Maybe they can go on walks or sit in the yard. The daily routine is important, so she has recommendations for life tasks and enjoyable activities for each time of the day. Physical activity really helps both their health and their emotions. As our author notes, exercising together can mean sharing a walk, a bike ride, a swim, or a game of tennis. These times can also afford a chance to hold hands, reminisce, and find pleasure, and perhaps even joy. And our author has another long list of suggested enriching activities. And Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan both suffered from dementia. In her concluding chapters, our good author, Koenig Coste, has an important chapter on caring for the care partner. You need to take care of yourself. She observes that sometimes family can be less than helpful, and sometimes they are eager to give advice while being equally reluctant to assist in any way. Sometimes out of guilt, they refuse to recognize the efforts of the caregiver. People don't change just because a family member falls ill or succumbs to dementia. But remember, it's the job of Jesus to judge. Just let them be. Our author notes, exercising together can mean sharing a walk, a bike ride, a swim, or a game of tennis. These times can also afford a chance to hold hands, reminisce, and find pleasure and perhaps even joy. And our author has another long list of suggested enriching activities. And she also has good advice in chapters on receiving home care and on receiving care outside the family home. Now, we also recommend purchasing the Dementia Caregivers Guide because learning to speak Alzheimer's was written 20 years ago. Although it covers much of the same material, it does provide a different perspective. The guide discusses the various therapies that are available. One major difference is that Coates, in the older book, is adamantly opposed to reality orientation therapy for dementia patients. In her experience, she thinks it is harmful to even try to bring them back to reality. But the newer guide does state that if a patient is so deeply grounded in their false reality that they cannot be convinced otherwise, it is wise to leave them alone in their delusions. The guide also discusses reminiscence therapy, cognitive stimulation therapy, and occupational therapy. What treatments are available for dementia? The problem in trying to treat neurological disorders is that the body protects the brain by erecting a blood-brain barrier, which means it can be challenging to find drugs that will not be blocked and will reach the brain. Injecting the drugs into the bloodstream rather than swallowing medications helps somewhat. The drug that has been recently approved for Alzheimer's that has so much enthusiasm surrounding it has problematic side effects. It often causes swelling and bleeding in certain brain areas, causing other side effects like headaches, nausea, vision challenges, or confusion. And there are also other drugs with potentially awful side effects for dementia. Another problem with all of these drugs is they never repair the damage already done by dementia. They can only delay further deterioration. And as before, there is a type of dementia that is curable. And this guide also has the same type of lists and steps of disease progression. And the guide also discusses the various types of dementia, and we will save this discussion for a later blog and video. What lifestyle changes can we implement to prevent dementia? Mainly the big three, some say 4 magical cures for most conditions. Diet, exercise, plenty of sleep, and an active social life. What is the most important factor for preventing dementia and also for dementia patients? Some doctors say diet, and especially dementia patients can be sensitive to certain types of food. One healthy diet to lower cholesterol and triglycerides, and some say blood pressure, is the DASH diet that I'm familiar with. And of course, you should have input from your doctor or dietitian before you decide on a diet, either for you or for your dementia patient. Other doctors say exercise is more important. Light or moderate exercise for dementia patients, and more vigorous exercise for those who are healthy. And why would exercise be more important than diet? The brain is hungry for oxygen. It consumes about 1/4 of the oxygen we breathe. And exercise feeds the brain of this precious healing oxygen. And adequate sleep is also very important, as is social life. We're also investigating whether the police are being trained on how to deal with the elderly who may be showing signs of dementia. This is challenging. Anyone over 70 or even 60 who has anger issues, or is making sexually inappropriate comments or actions, or has not been paying their bills, may be suffering from dementia. And this might even be true if the person has a history of these issues, as dementia often worsens or undesirable personality traits. And there may not be any clear indications of dementia if our dealings with them are cursory. Now, many police departments, particularly in my state, Florida, have CIT police training programs through NAMI, which cover mental illnesses. But currently, typically, these only cover autism, drug abuse issues, and mental issues with younger offenders. But we do know that there are discussions between the Alzheimer's Association, NAMI, and the police departments locally to address this training issue, and perhaps nationally as well. This video reviews several Atlantic articles discussing the police CIT training and awareness on mental illness, particularly in Miami, Florida, and in Texas, and how the Miami-Dade judicial system has addressed mental illness. And we're also planning a video on Oliver Sacks' famous study on the man who mistook his wife for a hat, and other clinical tales. This covers patients with all sorts of neurological issues, including dementia.